Order, order! I never get to say that, so that's quite exciting for me. Thank you very much for all coming along to the, hey, come on. Protecting the Blue Frontier, Combating Unregulated Fishing in the South Atlantic, kindly hosted by the Falkland Islands Government. My name is Edward Morello. I'm the Lib Dem Member of Parliament for West Dorset, and I've been volunteered to chair this. I know nothing about this subject, so this is going to be a car crash at best, but luckily I'm surrounded by subject matter experts in this area. So to my right I have the Honourable John Birmingham MLA, who is a member of the Falkland Islands Legislative Assembly on and off for 31 years, I believe we were talking about beforehand. As well as being the portfolio holder for health and social care, he is also the deputy portfolio holder for natural resources, which includes fisheries, so he'll be able to give us a useful insight. To my left and your right, Dr. Al Pinkerton, the MP for Surrey Heath, something of a UK overseas expert, having been a professor of geopolitical risk, he says carefully. Visited the Falkland Islands numerous times, and including, I believe, being an observer at the referendum.
That's right,
2013. Yeah, so a Falkland Islands expert, we hope. And at the end of the table, Lucy Kay, who's the Public Affairs Manager at Open Seas, which is a charity focused on protecting our marine environment and all things that live in it. So we will hopefully have some interesting points to cover at the beginning, and then we'll come out to you for questions. So do have a think about that. I think rather than me waffling on for too long, it's probably best that I go to John to give us a bit of a scene setter in terms of, for those of us like me who don't know what the blue hole is, he can perhaps tell us, and also importantly what the relevance is to the Falkland Islands. So John, if we want to turn over to you.
Okay, well, good morning to everybody that's here. Thank you for coming. As has been said, John Birmingham, a member of the legislature of the Falkland Islands, which is, for those who are not aware, an overseas territory of the United Kingdom, with a similar status to places such as Gibraltar, who are also here today. Thank you very much, our fellow overseas territories, and Bermuda, internally self-governing, with the United Kingdom looking after external affairs and also defence. But in conjunction, very much so in the modern world, with the local politicians. But we're here today to discuss the blue hole. There are actually two blue holes that are known about. One is the tourist blue hole around the Belize area of the Caribbean, which is known for its diving. But the one that we're interested in, and why we're here today, is the one in the South Atlantic, which is an area that is unregulated, unpoliced. It is the Wild West of the fisheries world, and despite many attempts at trying to get countries to talk about this unregulated fishing, it still exists. Upwards of 500 vessels can be in a given zone at some point throughout the year. Pictures of aircraft and satellite imagery indicate that it's at night time it can be like a small city with so many fishing vessels, mainly from one particular country in the Far East, that are fishing out the seas there. Now, it's a long way from the United Kingdom, absolutely. It's not that far from our zone, but it has a global impact. And if the United Nations, as the body that looks after the oceans, and the governments of the world cannot do something about it in the near future, then I think there is going to come a time where, in generations to come, they will ask the questions why we didn't do something. So during this hour's conversation, hopefully, there will be some discussion and some questions from the floor.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to come to Lucy actually, if it's all right, just to sort of talk about, help us understand from a marine wildlife perspective why this matters.
Sure. Can everyone hear? Is that picking up? Okay. Well, thanks also for the intro and for setting the scene, John. So the organisation I work for, Open Seas, we're predominantly focused on advocating for sustainable environment in the seas around the UK. But it's a pleasure to be on the panel today to talk a bit about the grave situation in the Blue Hole, where essentially, as John mentioned, we have an entirely unregulated fishery with a significant exploitation or extraction of the ilex squid. And that fishery has grown substantially over the last 10 years. Because of the unregulated nature of the fishing that's happening there, it falls outside, for example, of any what we call RFMO, a Regional Fisheries Management Organisation. They exist to set frameworks for the management of some fishing stocks in the high seas. There isn't one in place around the Blue Hole. Those that do exist in other parts of the world, I wouldn't claim they're all supremely effective, but they do have a role to play in establishing frameworks for the sustainable management of some shared stocks, tuna being a prime example. This unregulated space, obviously, the risks associated with that, and particularly with squid, which is a short-lived species that only lives for around a year, is that essentially we don't have the scientific assessment of the health of that stock beyond the national waters of the Falklands and of Argentina, where there are quite strong fisheries management measures in place. So essentially we are in a situation where there is risk to the health and sustainability of that stock and the way that it's being exploited. So there's an urgent need for greater scientific understanding of the health of the stock, the sustainability of the level of fishing that's currently taking place, and in the absence of that, there is a real need to take a more precautionary approach. But in fact, what's happening is quite the opposite. We have essentially a free-for-all in terms of the rate of extraction of this species. And the other thing I wanted to reference is why would it matter to us in the UK as perhaps consumers of seafood? And the reality is that whilst we have a great fishing heritage in this country, we actually export most of the fish that we catch around the UK. And the fish that we eat, over 80% of it is imported from many, many parts of the world. We aren't the biggest market for this squid species, but the point is, this global seafood market that the UK very much relies on is not renowned for being traceable and transparent. There are some systemic risks in seafood imports. And the checks that we have at the border in terms of catch certificates are perhaps not what they could be in terms of really uncovering IUU or illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing products entering this country. And often those products are tainted with risks of human rights abuse in the supply chain, as well as obviously sustainability risks to the stocks themselves. So the UK has a market interest in ensuring that we are sourcing sustainably from around the world, and I think that's an important context to bring to the conversation and to kind of, I guess, go in depth in terms of thinking about fisheries policy.
Lucy, before I come to Al, just in terms of, just for the uninformed, and I count myself the leader of them, regional fisheries management organisations, do you want to just explain to us what one of those is?
Yes, so essentially it's an organisation that represents the generally collaborative interests of nations who either are adjacent to a particular fishing area, so in the case of the Blue Hole that might be the Falklands, that might be Argentina, but also represent the interests of distant water fishing fleet vessels, so whether they're from China, Spain, wherever they're from in the world. If you have an interest in that fishery, then the purpose of the RFMO is to enable all of those people with interest to come together to agree management measures. Like I said, they're not always effective, like any international frameworks, but they are an established mechanism by which to attempt to govern these otherwise unregulated spaces. The other thing I just wanted to touch on before I will start, I promise, is that there's been some really interesting developments in the past 10 days on these issues. So we've seen last week the World Trade Organization's prohibition or agreement on fisheries subsidies came into force, and that is an agreement which essentially prevents countries from subsidizing the parts of their fleet that may be fishing in the unregulated high seas, and prevents them from subsidizing the fishing of stocks that are already deemed to be overfished. So there's a new mechanism there to potentially leverage trade relationships to try to curb some of this activity. And we've also seen the 61st ratification of the High Seas Treaty, which is a UN treaty which will for the first time create a mechanism to establish marine protected areas in the high seas. So until now there has not been a mechanism to do that in international law. This creates that route, and it will come into force now. It's been ratified by 60+ countries. It will come into force in January next year. So there is some potential positives to talk about. And the only other thing I'd add is that Open Seas were part of the Coalition for Fisheries Transparency, and one of the things we really want to see in the UK is the adoption of the Global Charter for Fisheries Transparency, which basically sets out...
We're going to come back to that.
Okay, okay. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Al, because before we get into what we think needs to happen, I think it's probably worth just positioning the Falklands, for those of us who don't know where it is, very far away, according to Richard, who told me it took 18 hours to get here. But its distance, as John has already mentioned, its distance from the UK means that it does sit in a very different geopolitical setting. And I think before we get into what needs to be done, it's probably best understanding what the issues are around its location, where the Falklands are, its neighbours, that sort of geopolitical issue, and what those barriers are to comprehensive agreements.
Yeah, thanks Ed, and thank you to the Falkland Islands government for putting on this event, and to John and to Lucy for your fantastic contributions as well. Many of you, given that you are here, will know roughly where the Falkland Islands are in the southwest Atlantic, just north of Antarctica. You can probably see them bobbing there in the Southern Ocean, 350 miles or so from the coast of Argentina, and many thousands of miles away from the UK. And of course you will also associate the Falkland Islands with events in 1982, but also potentially the events of 2013, when, as John or Ed said, I was an observer of the Falkland Islands referendum, in which 99.8% of Falkland Islanders said that they wished to remain a UK overseas territory. And I have been to the Falklands, I don't know, perhaps 6 times now, most recently a couple of years ago when I led a delegation of young people from the United Kingdom as part of the Falklands 40 Schools programme as a way of displaying to young people from the UK what the Falklands were in the early part of the 21st century, which of course is a self-governing and self-determining and self-supporting democracy and economy. But geopolitics still very much informs the way that Falkland Islanders live their lives and are able to exploit the natural resources around their islands. In so many ways, of course, the events of 1982 were a catastrophic tragedy for the British service personnel who lost their lives, and indeed for several Falkland Islanders who lost their lives. It was a violation of sovereignty that many Falkland Islanders still feel very acutely. But it would also be fair to say that the events of 1982 ultimately led to a transformation of the Falkland Islands economy that really means that the Falkland Islands economy now is dramatically different to the way that it was before 1982. Some of you will have heard of things like the Shackleton Report, which initially reported back in the late 1970s, but which was only enacted after 1982. And one of the key factors, or one of the key features of the Shackleton Report, was the recommendation that the Falkland Islands establish an exclusive economic zone around the islands, which would allow it to effectively create a fishery that would transform the Falklands economy, and that's exactly what has happened. And since that point in time, the Falklands has gone from being, frankly, what was a very poor and unequal economy to being, frankly, one of the richest per capita nations anywhere in the world. And the establishment of the fisheries transformed the Falkland Islands economy. And the blue hole that you've heard now referenced several times is one of the key threats to the sustainability of that fishery. So just beyond the exclusive economic zone, 200 miles north of the islands, between the Falklands and Argentina, you find this gap in regulation. And as John said, at night, when you look at satellite images, you can see this extraordinary phenomenon of Chinese, and I'm happy to name them, Chinese jiggers shining light deep into the ocean to draw squid to the surface. And there's such a concentration of these jiggers that you can genuinely see these the lights from space. It does look like a floating city in the middle of the Atlantic. And why does that space of unregulation exist? It's because the two key parties here have been unable to reach a sustainable way to manage that particular phenomenon. It hasn't always been that way. You look back into the past, and in 1990, the UK government and the Falkland and the Argentinian government signed a joint statement that led to the creation for about the best part of 15 years of something that looked like a regulatory regime, a kind of joint commission on fisheries, a fisheries agreement. By 2015 that was breaking down, and that very much coincided with the rise of the Kirchner administration in Argentina, the rise of nationalist politics, and indeed the politics of opportunism that you do sometimes see raise its head in Argentina. And so really from about 2015 to the present day, so the best part of a decade, that blue hole has become more of a phenomenon. But maybe that 1990 statement shows that there has previously been an appetite for regulation. And where I would absolutely agree with Lucy is that the new High Seas Treaty, or to give it its full title, the Agreement under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity of Areas Beyond Natural Jurisdiction. Catchy title. Snappy. High Seas Treaty is slightly easier shorthand. Potentially creates a more politically neutral framework for the possibility of coming back to a situation where, without the perceived loss of sovereignty or sovereign claims, there might be at least the basis for some kind of mutual attempt to regulate this space. Because the reason that this, of course, is so important for the UK is because it's so important to the Falkland Islands economy. If the sustainability of the Falkland Islands fishery is undermined by overfishing just outside this sovereign territory, and squid move freely in and out of the sea, then the United Kingdom also has a challenge, and the challenge is partly a financial one. The Falkland Islands is a self-governing, self-sustaining economy and democracy. Does the United Kingdom have the appetite, does it even have the ability to financially sustain an overseas territory?
Thank you very much, Al. So, John, it's probably worth coming back to you now for the Falkland Islands perspective, because as Al has pointed out, there was previously effectively a bilateral relationship agreement on this between the UK, Falklands and Argentina, and Lucy has also outlined some of the new things regulatory-wise that are coming in at an international standard. But where is the Falklands in terms of what works, what is coming down the line, what could work, what does the Falklands need to be comfortable that the protections are going to be in place?
With permission, I'll just pick up on a couple of points that Al just mentioned there. It is true that there was a treaty signed between the United Kingdom and Republic of Argentina in the early 90s, of which, because of the political situation, the Falkland Islands weren't officially there, but we were there. It won't be a surprise for anybody. Governments change, attitudes change. The coming of the Kirchner regime, as Alan mentioned, very nationalistic approach taken to all manner of things, which resulted in the economy collapsing at one point there. The scientific community in Argentina, the environmental community in Argentina fully appreciate the dangers of overfishing around their coasts, but also in the deeper waters, and so that's not the problems at all. The problems that we face are purely political. Hopefully, the new High Seas Treaty will, I'm not going to go through its entire title, the new treaty will go some way towards it, but ultimately, whatever law is put in place, even if it's an international law, it has to be policed. And unless you have the ability and cooperation to police something, then it's just a piece of paper. The Chinese government, who fully support the political aspirations of the Argentine government when it comes to our islands, will not enter into any discussion with our government at all. If everybody was able to work together, we could do something about this. The treaty that's just been agreed may well go some way towards that but you mentioned about what are we doing. We can only protect our own parish at the moment. So the Falkland Island government have had a very successful fishery for the last 30-something years. We've invested a lot of money in science. We've invested a lot of money in making sure that there's compliance. We've upgraded the regulations both when it comes to the environmental conditions of crew members on the ships, so much so that there's been, we've had congratulations from the United Nations on this. Some of these people were at sea for years on occasion, still showering in seawater. The conditions some few decades ago were atrocious. So we're pleased about that. We also invested a couple of years ago in a new fisheries protection vessel with the catchy title Lilybet, which strikes fear into the heart of any pirate fishing vessels, no doubt. But it's a very capable ship, it's fast, it's manoeuvrable. This last year, big major investment in technology, so that every vessel that's below the River Plate actually, that's got the electronics on board, we can monitor. We have a view of some ships, many ships that black themselves out. We can see this, but seeing something happening isn't the same as being able to do something. And yes, everything else, and I'll finish shortly, everything else said about the Falklands economy is true, no doubt about that. The Falkland Islands, by the way, are now gaining more strategic importance to the Western Allies, where we are. But also, going back to the global significance of that part of the ocean. We had a Canadian environmentalist in the islands some years ago who suggested that we shouldn't be worrying about the big mammals in the sea. We shouldn't be worrying about the fish in the sea and neglecting the small things that live in the sea, because everything's a way up the ladder.
Yeah, 100%. Well, look, John, you've brought up a very pertinent point to this discussion, and I probably will get both Lucy and Al's view on this, which is, whether or not, and Lucy, I'll start with you. You've outlined some of the treaties that have recently passed and the ones that are coming up, but those are regulatory agreements, and as we've already mentioned, there is no regional fisheries management organisation. Is regulation, is working groups, are those the solution, when John has rightly highlighted that one of the biggest issues is always going to be enforcement? And in terms of the regulation that has been passed and that's coming down the line, does any of that resolve the enforcement issue?
Thanks. I think it absolutely has a part that it can play, but it totally depends on the energy that goes into making those regulations have impact and bite, and that obviously requires interested states to work towards that. And actually, if you're going to create, let's say, a protected area, you're going to need to, as John mentioned, monitor and police that. Otherwise, it's not worth much beyond the paper it's written on. You could take some of those lessons to domestic UK fisheries management as well. We have a lot of marine protected areas that are, not always offering the level of protection that people might expect when you find out that, trawling and other types of fishing is permitted. We're seeing efforts potentially to strengthen that coming up, and that's something we really welcome. But yes, any sort of regulatory framework or concept is only worth the paper it's written on if it is meaningfully delivered. I think there are things that lie within the capacity of individual states to take firmer action on, and part of that is around driving transparency in the parts of the fisheries that are legitimate, that are operating within regulatory norms. And that's what Starcis mentioned earlier, is the Global Charter for Fisheries Transparency, which is the Coalition for Fisheries Transparency's principles for putting a spotlight essentially on legitimate fishing activity and ensuring that that is therefore very easy to identify, which makes it perhaps a little bit easier to expose illegality. And that's everything from ensuring that vessel lists are kept up to date. It's about publishing information on what subsidies and sanctions each nation is is either enforcing or creating. It's things like improving transparency over the ultimate beneficial ownership of vessels. So there's not sort of 10 different ownership levels before you find out what the parent company is, who actually owns and benefits from that resource. There's a lot more we can do to make vessel tracking data public. And John mentioned vessels turning off their AIS. That's their automatic kind of transponders that record their location. Some countries also have VMS data on vessels, which can be made public but isn't always. Again, that would allow civil society, scientists and others to really look at what fishing activities are happening, and to better understand where those are being recorded appropriately and where they are not. And then basically, I suppose the short message is making as much data about your own fishing fleet available as possible, because if all nations, if all states with an interest in sustainable productive management of the seas did that, it would make it easier to expose illegality. Whether it makes it easier to act on it is the challenge, but there is a role for markets to play as well. Big seafood retailers, they do want largely, or claim to want, to source responsibly. So if you create avenues where it's easier to identify legitimately sourced seafood and legally sourced seafood, then hopefully you can exclude from markets products where there are questions around its provenance. So I think those are some things you could do. And at the UK level, we have catch certification to check seafood imports. We don't always have the resource, or the port authorities don't always have the resources we would want to conduct checks at the level we want to see. So imports do still come into the UK from Russia, for example, of seafood. So you'd want to see that that's being checked. Russia's linked to IUU fishing, but we don't. The level of checks on those catch certificates isn't necessarily as great as you'd hope. So there's lots of things.
IUU for the stupid
sorry, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing.
Wonderful.
I've probably
Thank
said
you
that
very
many
much.
times.
Al, so a whole cacophony of issues around this. We've got huge Chinese operations, other actors undoubtedly. We've got vessels with flags of convenience, which means that we don't necessarily know where they're registered, and Lucy's outlined that sort of ownership, complex ownership structure. And I go back to my earlier point, the Falklands is very, very far away, and I've no doubt of the capabilities of Lilybets, but it is one vessel in a very large sea. And then, of course, as you were mentioning before, we have that sort of slightly difficult relationship with Argentina as well. So in terms of going beyond regulation, going into policing, whether it be an international framework agreement where all parties sign up, and some of those parties, like China, simply won't, how do you police an area so large, so far away?
Well, undoubtedly with great difficulty. The first challenge that the UK has is that it needs to ratify the High Seas Treaty, and that was brought to the House for its first reading last Thursday, its second reading on the 16th of October. And I think then the challenge is, if that gets through Parliament, which I think it should, I think it's a really important international agreement, it's then the extent to which the UK wants to throw its energies into making itself a leading player in that new international setup. I think there has to be the first international meeting of those signatory parties within 12 months of the 60th country signing up, which, as you said, happened last week. Sri Lanka and Morocco signed up, which tipped us over the 60. So this will be coming into force very soon. And I would suggest that Britain might be very well advised to be on the front foot of that, to be instrumental in thinking about how this gets codified and administered, to think about exactly those kind of issues of policing, to embed enforcement and transparency right into the heart of that international agreement. And even though some parties who are undoubtedly involved in illegal fishing here may not sign up, I think there's an immediate power in having that international framework. So there's a legislative route, and then there's the implementation of that legislation that's really important. The other thing, to pick up on something John said, is about science and diplomacy. And to be fair to Argentina, even though they've had their political difficulties or they've lost the political appetite to get involved, there's always been a scientific appetite to collaborate, and that's one of the languages of cooperation. Science often speaks beyond politics. And so there is an Argentine national level program, the Pampa Azul program, this kind of scientific endeavour to gather information. Plus also we've got fantastic institutions in the UK and in the Falkland Islands. SARI, the South Atlantic Environmental Research Institute, and the British Antarctic Survey, who are leading in this area along with Falkland Islands fisheries, Falklands conservation and other charities. So there is an opportunity there between those institutions to have powerful conversations, to do some of that transparency work, and to build trust between partners. And maybe there's a way between those institutions, the scientific institutions and those conservation institutions, plus this new legislative approach, that will lead to a productive way to bring countries into some productive conversation, and to think collectively about how that enforcement gets done, because it will require cooperation between the UK, the Falklands and Argentina.
I'm going to come to the audience for questions in just a second, so start having a think about what your Newsnight-esque, real take the panel over the coals type questions are. Put them on the spot, not me, I'm going to answer them, so go crazy. But before I do, I just want to check if there's any final quick points that you want to make before we go to the audience.
Yes, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Just as a bit of background from Falkland Island point of view, just to illustrate the way we deal with the question of fishing discipline within our zone. So our main commitment is to sustainability. No question about it. We want there to be something in the seas in years to come. And for that we spend, as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of money. We have 10 observers that go on various ships and they record what they see. The nets, if it's a trawler, are all measured. Everything is recorded. We have a bycatch mitigation officer office. So anything that's brought up that shouldn't be being caught, we're starting to build a real major database of those kind of issues. Our commitment to environmental stewardship is absolute. We have we've got a Marine Stewardship Council certification, which we've had for the last 10 years on our toothfish, Patagonian toothfish, which we sell, which is very valuable fish. So we are doing whatever we can, and we are willing to work with all partners. But Big Brother, as in the United Kingdom, we look to Big Brother to assist us in a way going forward.
Wonderful, thank you. Lucy, any final points?
Yes, thank you. And actually, I think it follows John's point nicely, which is that coming on Al's point in terms of the UK showing leadership on this, to have credibility in that space, the UK needs to improve its domestic fisheries management as well. And in this, in the UK, we still have issues with catches being set and allocated above best available scientific advice. We need to see that stop. We still have our MPAs inadequately protected. We still have huge issues with bycatch in the fishery that goes marine protected areas. Sorry, Ed. We still have huge issues with bycatch risks that essentially are potentially being ignored. So we need to see greater use of technology to push back on systematic problems such as like bycatch and illegal discarding. And we need to see the UK take greater advantage of the status it has as an independent coastal state, which it is one of the opportunities it's had since 2020. It's got some great legislation in the form of the Fisheries Act, but we're not seeing that legislation fully implemented. For example, that act says we should be distributing fishing quota in ways that incentivise lower impact, highly selective fishing. We are not using quota in that way at the moment. It's going out to those largely with the deepest pockets. So there are some fundamental things that the UK needs to address at home. And so I just want to make sure that message lands as well.
Thank you, Lucy. Alan, do you want to add before we get to questions?
Well, just to reiterate that the Blue Hole is in so many ways an exemplar of poor ocean governance that we have lived with for a very long time. There is a new treaty that offers a new possibility, and I would just suggest that the UK would be well advised to be a leader on that, to push for not just the ratification and not just full participation in that scheme, but also a regional fisheries management organisation to sit alongside that agreement, but then also speak the language of science and diplomacy to bring all of those actors together, because I think that is where trust can ultimately emerge from.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I will give each of you 2 minutes before I close to make any final remarks after the questions. We're going to go to the audience for some questions. I may be a liberal, but this is where I become very illiberal, okay? So, a reminder, a question is a sentence that ends in a question mark, okay? If we have the world's leading experts in the blue hole in the room, you still only get to ask a question and not deliver a sermon, okay? So the gentleman with the microphone will be militant in pulling it away if you decide to give a presentation, all right? So who would like the dubious honour of going first? We've got a couple of hands going up. Gentleman in the back, I'll take you first if that's all right.
Thank you. I guess the question is, what is the appetite within the UK government to actually to bring this enforcement forward?
Excellent, excellent. An exemplar of what a question should be. Thank you very much. I'll start with Lucy, because you probably do more of the advocacy on the UK government side of things, so perhaps you want to answer that question.
Yes, I mean, I suppose it would like us to think it's got the appetite, but it has taken the government a while to bring forward that BBNJ bill, which is essentially the precursor to the UK ratifying the UN High Seas Treaty. So the UK has been a bit lethargic on that, and you know it's come under significant pressure. Greenpeace ran a great campaign focused on this ahead of the UN Ocean Summit back in June. So it's taken the UK a while to get to the plate, and as a result, we are not among the first 60 nations to ratify that treaty. It's coming into force ahead of that UK involvement, which I think is a missed opportunity. I think positively, we've seen the Labour government welcome the broad principles of the Global Charter for Fisheries Transparency, but we've yet to see as much energy in terms of actually moving forward alignment to that charter in this country, in terms of publishing, for example, more information about our fisheries enforcement efforts. So there's definitely work to be done, and you know we are seeing as well progress towards potentially establishing these prohibitions on trawling in some of our offshore MPAs. It's in consultation at the moment. It remains to be seen how robust the ultimate action is. So I would say it's a mixed picture, but there's reason to think the UK would like to do better on this and sees the benefits of protecting this incredible marine environment both around our seas and beyond. But obviously warm words need to be backed up by substantive action, and that's what we'll be hoping to see and pressing for.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Sitting as you do within the Falkland legislature, looking at the UK, what's your view on
I'd like to say that the Falkland Island government, as I'm representative here, we look upon the current British government as being very supportive, as indeed all British governments have been supportive for the last 40 years, and the major parties such as your party, which isn't in government at present, also is very supportive. The current British government and now Minister Doherty is exceptionally interested in the Falkland Islands, Minister for Overseas Territories, and one of the ministers, and we have a good relationship. It's recognised that there is a lot of work that needs doing, but it's also recognised that the in-trade is rather large, but we're confident that there will be movement.
Wonderful. Al, sitting on the other side of the benches, any view on the government?
I mean, I guess sitting in Parliament, it's a blink and you miss it. This has not been high profile. This has not been an active area of deep discussion. You might feel that as well as I do. And I think maybe that's representative of just a slight slipping off the political agenda. You know, I have many criticisms of previous Conservative governments, but there was under Boris Johnson, gosh, I really don't want to give him any, and David Cameron, but there was an emphasis on ocean governance and particularly the Blue Belt, and particular kind of claims that were being made about Britain's contribution to global biodiversity protection. Whether that in itself was helpful is open to debate, but I think I think certainly if it's being discussed, it's being discussed in whispers at the moment.
Agree. Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Questions? Third row back, ladies and gentlemen.
Hi there, Alex Rogers from the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton. I was just, clearly this fishery is against many of the provisions of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement. And I was just wondering whether the UK government had looked at taking this as a case to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. And in terms of the BBNJ agreement, have you looked at the emergency measures provisions of the BBNJ? Because it strikes me that that could be a useful route to pursue.
Thank you. Lucy, we're probably coming back to you on whether or not we should be taking legal routes.
So, I'm not sure I have a straightforward answer to that. I would just say this is a particularly, I guess, grave example of the kind of unregulated fishing we see, but squid fisheries generally, I think something like 86% are largely unregulated. So whilst what's happening in the Blue Hole is particularly unique in that there is no RFMO at all in that area, other RFMOs do cover squid, but don't necessarily have it as a species that they list conservation measures for. So it is not completely atypical, unfortunately. So I don't know on that basis how effective that legal challenge would be. I wouldn't like to speculate, but I think it's an interesting thought. There was another part of that question which I...
Emergency measures.
Yeah.
BBNJ.
Well, I think it remains to be seen what those emergency measures provisions will yield. I would say the other thing that I think is an interesting part of that treaty is the environmental impact assessments that need to be put in place for activities in the high seas, which could be another route to kind of say, right, we need to get a proper, the nations responsible for these fishing activities need to prove what their environmental impact is and demonstrate that it's sustainable or not. And that's another route that treaty could be used within that treaty, separate to just the MPA's designation side of it. All interesting and worth further discussion, I think, but I think it's too early to say, to be honest, in terms of how productive those routes will prove.
I think John wants to come in on this one.
There's a fair question, and what we in the Falkland Islands are trying to do is, with the help of the British government, is a softly approach with the Argentine government. They've got their midterm elections within the next month to 6 weeks. We don't know how they're going to go. The present government is not as unpopular as we thought it was going to be. But by taking such a big hammer may cause us as much damage as anything else. We prefer cooperation and go the way of further involvement of the scientific community first.
Wonderful, thank you. Alan, if you want to
Well, I would just say, I think John's put his finger on it. There's politics at play here, and international relations at play, and with that dissolution in 2005 of the Formers Fishery Agreement, it just becomes much more difficult to speak with one coordinated and coherent voice, and I think that is holding back exactly the kind of mechanisms that the gentleman here is suggesting. And who knows whether this new treaty, if and when the UK ratifies it, maybe that will become a more politically neutral, politically palatable way to pursue exactly the kind of possibilities that the gentleman mentioned.
questions? Lady there, third row back.
Bearing in mind that this industry is currently unregulated, do we have any indication of how much of the squid caught in the Blue Hole ends up in our restaurants here in the UK?
Albert, like you were ready to burst out of your
Well,
seat
gosh.
there.
I mean, I wish I knew. I mean, of course, what we do know is that the majority of squid that's caught in Falkland Islands waters ends up in Spanish restaurants in Spain. And so I think you can probably come to a reasonable assumption that a significant quantity of the illegally caught fish is also making its way into those kind of networks. as well. One of the challenges is that it's actually very difficult to know sometimes because those transponders, as Lucy says, are turned off whilst fishing is being undertaken. Very often boats then may enter Falkland Islands waters and then leave again, having turned transponders on and off. It's actually very difficult ultimately to trace whether the squid caught in the blue hole is then being declared officially at any one point. Plus also you have movements of fish from ships at sea as well. So ultimately it's an incredibly difficult question to answer, but that's why that transparency and traceability becomes so vitally important.
Can you give us a size of a scale, some numbers?
I don't think I can actually, but I mean we do import a lot from China, but we're not the biggest market for squid. So most of it, I think you're right. Probably a decent chunk of it will go to Spain. But yes, I suspect some of it will slip through, because it gets processed. A lot of it will be processed in China into calamari rings or whatever else, and that's where the value is added in that supply chain. That processing element, which a huge amount of which happens in China, and there's not necessarily transparency in terms of exactly what squid is coming from where into China to then be processed into squid products. So it will have some information on the packaging, but it might be fairly generalised.
Okay, John?
Yeah, can I just mention there what Al said about transponders being turned off and on. If you liken it, the analogy would be of your bank account. The bank, if it sees unusual activity, will question that activity. The Falkland Island government, if we've got a licensed vessel and it turns off and on its transponder, we'll pull it in. We want to know what's going on. So we run a fairly tight ship, so we're content with our policing, although not perfect, we're content with what we do, but as I say, it's just within our parish.
Right, final question right at the front. Let's make a short and snappy and hilarious one.
Hello, I'm Matthew. I'm from East Somerset. I want to ask if you see Argentina working anytime soon with the UK government or Falkland Islands on this issue, or if it's a thing of the past.
Okay, John? We can do this as a yes or no if you like, because I'll give you time to do closing comments.
But as Shackleton famously said, onwards and upwards. We have to keep pushing at things.
Yeah. Al?
It's not impossible. However eccentric the current Argentine political leadership is, they are perhaps not quite as nationalistic as some previous governments have been. But of course, there's always the temptation to play to the nationalistic fervour of Argentine voters if and when needed. But I'm not saying it's impossible.
Lucy?
Yeah, I suppose the only thing I might say is that there is a very real economic incentive to properly regulate the fishery, to get a real substantive view of what the status of the stock is, because to manage it sustainably, which delivers significant economic benefits to the adjacent states, is a benefit, and indeed to the distant water fleet fishing there too. So there are some reasons to do this that go beyond sustainability from a purely environmental point of view and have an economic element to them. So I think there are reasons to get a grip on it. Whether that yields anything is an entirely different matter.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your questions. I'm going to give the panel an opportunity to have 2 minutes to make some closing remarks, thoughts, any final points that you haven't had a chance to land yet. And I think John has got breaking news for us, which is very exciting. So I'll go to John, then Lucy, and then I'll give you the final word. John, after you.
Sounds a bit dramatic. There's only one way now, isn't it? Down. So to conclude this session, from the Falkland Islands point of view, we've made significant strides in combating illegal fishing, protecting human rights, and ensuring environmental sustainability. But we do recognise that these are global challenges that require global solutions. By sharing our experiences and continuing to collaborate with partners like those here today, we can contribute to a more transparent, sustainable, and a just global fishing industry. And the breaking news is not quite breaking news because it happened on the 19th. We closed, as an example of the way the government in the Falkland Islands deals with this, we have two major squid fisheries. One is the Ilex fishery that comes down the South Atlantic, but we also have a local squid, a loligo, and we constantly monitor the loligo, and we just closed early the loligo season. So all those fishing companies that had licenses, with their agreement, because they also want fisheries to be sustainable, we have just closed it. This follows on from there not being a season last year. This, I would suggest, is a bit of a wake-up call for not just the Falkland Island waters, but for further out. And there really does need to be a major international push. And we're relatively confident that we seem to be along that road. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, John. Lucy, final thoughts?
Thanks. I think I just reiterate that point that to lead with credibility internationally, the UK needs to demonstrate best practice at home, and that means progressing towards alignment with the Global Charter. It means ensuring sustainable management of the stocks in our domestic waters, and essentially strengthening the terms and conditions to fish in UK seas, which it has the power to do, and embracing technology like REM to actually have a look at what's happening on vessels and tackle issues like bycatch. So we want to see all of that happening. We'd love to see the Lib Dems endorse the Global Charter, so that would be brilliant. And the last thing I'll say is if anyone is really interested to learn more about this, Environmental Justice Foundation just produced a very interesting report doing a deep dive on the squid fishery in and around the Blue Hole. It's called Bright Lights, Dim Prospects. It is a harrowing read because it does evidence human rights abuses and environmental harms. But if you are interested to learn more, I would take that as a next step, as a good report to read to kind of cover this, some of the key points for this issue.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Al?
It's Climate Nature Day here at Lib Dem Conference, so I think this particular panel session happens at a really useful time. These, as John says, are global issues, but they require practical solutions. And we do have presented to Parliament. We do have this bill that may be part of that, and I will certainly be following the ratification process very closely. And I know that, I'm very confident in saying that the Lib Dems are going to be hugely supportive of this international framework. But it's not just, of course, about climate and nature. As you've just said, Lucy, the Blue Hole also represents a space of legal lack of labour lack of regulation as well, and there's appalling stories of labour abuse and effectively modern day slavery on some of these vessels as well. So it goes beyond climate and nature. But what I'd also just like to say is I'd like to pay huge tribute to the Falkland Islands government for the regulatory regime that they have created. There's a really impressive combination of both a commitment to science and monitoring and transparency, and a real commitment to stewardship over your maritime space. I've seen it myself. I've spoken to the fisheries teams down in the Falklands, and I know how important this is. And it's not just important because it's vital to your economy, but I think you also understand that you are stewards of your own environment, and you can see it on the land and you can see it in the seas. And I hope that the United Kingdom will support you through the legal and regulatory frameworks that you need in order to take that further forward. So thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Well, listen, I appreciate all of you for coming here. It's been extremely informative. I think we have established the legal and regulatory framework that is in place, maybe found wanting. There is more that we can do in that space. The importance of enforcement, and as you've all mentioned, the UK demonstrating leadership on the international stage and domestically when it comes to marine protection. I'd like to pay huge tribute to the Falkland Islands government for organising today and to the ICCF. I'd like to thank John Birmingham, the portfolio holder for Health and Social Care and Natural Resources in the Falkland Islands Legislative Assembly. I'd like to thank Lucy Kay, who is the Public Affairs Manager at Open Seas, and Al Pinkerton, the Liberal Democrat MP for Surrey Heath. Thank you also to all of you for today. Please have a lovely day.